Welcome back to the second in our Growing Disciples series of 5 Psalms taken from the worshipping life of Israel. Stuart Holman here with you again. The Psalms, in their regular use in the temple, became very, very well known. Like the popular songs of our day, they were not only embedded in the culture of the people at the time, they actually shaped that culture. The repetition of the Psalms, their lyrics and the tunes that went with them, these shaped the spiritual framework within which people lived and prayed and worshipped. Their familiarity formed faith and expectation, hope and character. Our previous devotional on Psalm 53 was a maskil, a song intended to teach wisdom as it was sung as part of the liturgical life of the temple. And today's devotional from Psalm 54 is similarly set for our instruction, even though the theme is very different. Psalm 54 is all about betrayal, about being betrayed by someone you thought you could trust. Now, we all need wisdom when faced with such a situation, and David provides our example, our model in Psalm 54. Ultimately, however, this is a psalm that prepares us for Jesus Christ, and in doing so, perhaps we have an insight into his experience of the cross. Psalm 54 begins with this superscript: "For the director of music with stringed instruments, a maskil of David." So, similar to Psalm 53, this is another maskil wisdom psalm. But now we have more detail of the life situation in which it is set. When the Ziphites had gone to Saul and said, "Is not David hiding among us?" 1 Samuel 23 verses 13 through 23 tells the story of David's betrayal by the people of Ziph. David was on the run from King Saul, who planned to kill him just as soon as he could track him down. David and his men were living the furtive nomadic life of the outlaw. They were hiding out. They were hiding out in the desert of Ziph. Ziph is just about 20 kilometers from Bethlehem, the hometown of David's family. So being in familiar country, not far from his hometown, David, the former shepherd, he held a tactical advantage over Saul. Doubtless he expected other advantages while hiding out in this area. Particularly, he might have expected that the people of Ziph would extend some kind of loyalty to he and his men, at least by staying quiet and not dobbing him in to King Saul. But instead, the Ziphites betrayed David. The Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah and said, "Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horesh, on the hill of Hakilah, south of Jeshimon? Now, your majesty, come down whenever it pleases you to do so, and we will be responsible for giving him into your hands." So David hears that he's been betrayed, and he writes Psalm 54 as an expression of his grief and as a plea for vindication. Obviously, David was protected by God, and over time this song did become part of the worship of the people at the temple in all the years that followed. So it was sung as worship, but also as a means of instruction for the gaining of wisdom. It's a maskil. We might say that here is wisdom for when we are betrayed or ripped off, or treated unfairly or unjustly. So first of all, in this psalm, David pleads for God's salvation. "Save me, O God, by your name. Vindicate me by your might. Hear my prayer, O God. Listen to the words of my mouth." So in the face of betrayal, David entrusts himself to God for deliverance. This is the underlying instruction of the psalm. David doesn't take revenge in his own strength. Whatever feelings he might have in that moment of betrayal, he turns to God. There is restraint here. Emotions are channeled into this prayer, into this plea. Instead of an explosion of uncontrolled anger, David pleads with God for both salvation and vindication. Salvation usually has two dimensions or two levels in the Old Testament. First there's a physical saving from death. Don't let me be killed by Saul, even though I've been betrayed by the Ziphites. And the second idea of a spiritual salvation from eternal death beyond the grave, it's also present. But here it's a little more in the background. But the two should not be thought of as separate and disconnected. In the Psalms, to be saved now would be a reflection of an eternal salvation. Vindication for David would have meant that he was demonstrated ultimately to be God's anointed king. He was proven to be in the right with God and within Israel, especially in his dealings with Saul. So being saved and preserved in this situation of grave danger from the Ziphites, that will demonstrate God's approval and vindication of David. But right now, David's prayer is kind of urgent. There is an immediate problem. Verse 3, arrogant foes are attacking me. Ruthless people are trying to kill me. People without regard for God. Surely God is my help. The Lord is the one who sustains me. Well, what actually happens in the situation? Well, God does indeed deliver David. And as is expressed, I suppose, if we look at the conclusion of the psalm, we could read the details of God's protection and vindication of David in 1 Samuel chapter 23. There, he and his men keep on moving from place to place, hiding in caves and keeping a low profile. The Ziphites keep informing Saul of David's movements, like all spies and informants do. And then eventually we read this. As Saul and his forces were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul saying, "Come quickly, the Philistines are raiding the land." Then Saul broke off his pursuit of David and went to meet the Philistines. And so God did save David. It wasn't a decisive victory, but the unlikely nature of the deliverance surely displays the hand of God. And so David, having entrusted himself to God, even in the midst of betrayal, he now responds with thankfulness and praise in verse 6. I will sacrifice a free will offering to you. I will praise your name, Lord, for it is good. You have delivered me from all my troubles, and my eyes have looked in triumph on my foes. So this song of instruction teaches the worshippers how to respond to betrayal. That's great. But there's something more going on here. You see, David's experience of deliverance from the hand of his betrayer also shapes the faithful Jews' expectations of the greater David to come. That promised and majestic son of David would similarly be betrayed, and in that betrayal entrust himself to God alone for deliverance. There was no doubt a source of real grief for Jesus, especially at that Last Supper. Although foreshadowed by David's experience, Judas's treachery and infidelity must have hurt more than anything David experienced. But as that final night wore on, to varying degrees, Jesus would experience the abandonment of all of his disciples. His closest three could not even keep watch with him as he prayed. The bravest of all would crumble under the cross-examination of a servant girl, denying he ever even knew Jesus. Abandonment, betrayal, injustice, this is what Jesus experienced from the human race. But he did not lash out in anger. Instead, he submitted his way to God his Father. He trusted him for salvation and vindication. God the Father showed him to be in the right. He was justified. And truly so, as God's Messiah, is exactly how it was supposed to turn out. The pattern established by David in the face of betrayal was more than fulfilled by Jesus Christ. Rather than take matters into his own hands, he entrusted himself to the Father, with the result that he was obedient all the way to the cross, through death, to his resurrection and his glorification. So what will you do when you feel betrayed? Is this something that maybe has already happened for you, and maybe you need to work on your response to that feeling of betrayal, or maybe not? You see, the beauty of psalms such as this one, Psalm 54, being included in the regular liturgies of the temple was that already we are learning wisdom from praying this prayer even before we need to put it into practice. That's how the psalms operate for us in the life of the Christian person, as it was in the temple. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.